Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for standing by, and welcome to the LexisNexis Risk Solutions Know Your Customer and Due Diligence webinar. Here are a few brief announcements. During the presentation, all participants will be in a listen-only mode. If you have a question during the presentation, please use the Q&A feature located at the bottom of your screen. As a reminder, this conference is being recorded. If you have any issues within the presentation or the media player, please press F5 on your PC to refresh your screen. Today's presenters include Vivek Chathrath. Vivek joined Deutsche Bank Hong Kong in 2018 as a Managing Director, Head of Financial Crime Operations, and also the Deputy Head of Anti-Financial Crime, AFC, for Asia Pacific, or APAC. He is responsible for jointly managing and executing the entire regional and country AFC functions and program for the APAC region. Vivek has wide experience within banking, with senior management positions in Hong Kong and Japan. Vivek has a degree in accounting and economics from the University of Southampton and is a qualified accountant. Also speaking today is Douglas Wolfson. Douglas is the Director of Financial Crime Compliance for LexisNexis Risk Solutions in Asia. Headquartered in Hong Kong, he drives the strategy and product development of the risk tools used by the biggest banks in the world that help to mitigate financial crime for compliance issues. Douglas has 18 years of financial services, risk management, and international business experience. This includes leading risk management departments at the world's most recognizable financial institutions. And now over to you, Doug. Welcome.
That's great, Mary. Thank you so much. We appreciate the intros, and thank you, Viv, for joining me this morning. Welcome, everybody, to our webinar on facing KYC and CDD challenges. Excited to be here today. I should note before I go through the agenda, my marketing team has asked me to let everybody know that today is my birthday. 42 years young, so please get on LinkedIn, connect with me, and wish me a happy birthday, and maybe we can talk a little bit more about compliance, which is one of my absolute favorite subjects to discuss on my birthday. We're going to be discussing today the issues facing banks, and I'm delighted to have Viv here with a wealth of experience, and he's going to give us the bank's view on a lot of the issues they're facing today in regulation, quality assurance, in really what is in some ways trying to bring forward historical processes into a greater age of automation, into machine learning, artificial intelligence, and the issues that they're facing today. Then I'm going to talk to you a bit about how you want to think about your solutions, how when the issues that banks are facing today, when you can look at them from a different point of view and think about simplistically how you can start to solve these problems. We're going to have a bit of a chat and then Q&A where we will answer your questions if you have them. So please, if you have questions, put them into the question and answer box, and we will get to them. So without further ado, Viv, thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Doug, and thank you, Mary, for the introduction, and obviously delighted to be able to participate here in the LexisNexis webinar on what is certainly one of the most important topics that faces all financial institutions and has such a heightened focus with our regulators across the Asia-Pacific region, and that is, KYC. If there's one thing that I've seen over the years, when regulators come here on site, it really is KYC, transaction monitoring have been two big areas. And obviously on today's webinar, we're going to be focusing on, from my perspective, what have been some of the challenges that we face from a banking perspective with KYC. And I think a lot of the things, hopefully, that I'll be articulating and outlining, resonate with a lot of you that are on this webinar today. So to take off a few themes, and it's such a broad spectrum, and as Doug mentioned, we'll have a Q&A and also a discussion later on. But I thought I'll just kick off firstly with probably, in my view, the most important is on the regulatory theme. Yeah. And any of you working in a financial institution will see when your regulators come in, it can be the MAS, the HKMA, the RBI in India, KYC does take a prominent focus. And that takes a prominent focus in a number of factors. One is relating to the quality of documentation. is the documentation we're receiving up to date? A big area with a lot of banks is file reviews and remediation. There's deadlines that we're all facing that we're accountable to. Are we on track to meet those deadlines? Are we on track to perform KYC remediation? And it is really a focus that the regulators take very, very seriously and hold the institutions to account and the relevant functions as well. Another area where they really will spend a lot of time looking into is adherence to the local regulations. As you would have seen here in Asia Pacific, a lot of regulators have been playing what we can sort of say a catch-up mode. Previously, it's really been the regulators in Hong Kong and Singapore that have led the way in setting KYC standards and what is required. And obviously the other regulators now have seen that as an area they need to come up with. And that faces challenges with institutions because many institutions were operating across locations. And we also have to adhere to our home country. So I'm now obviously with a European bank. Previously I was with a US bank. And you have to, look at the updates that are happening with your home country regulators and obviously vis-a-vis with the countries that you operate, because obviously at the end of the day you have to make sure you are in adherence in the country that you're licensed with, in the country you're operating. And to be fair, in most of the times and cases there are issues where it is standardized, the requests, the requirements that you're needed as part of KYC and as part of file reviews are standardized, but nonetheless it is very, very important, and the regulators will certainly hold you to account to make sure that you're fulfilling that, and also that you're doing them within the required timeframes and not taking forever.
So let me ask, since we're on the subject and it's hot, rather than waiting for the discussion, would you say that the number one driver from your perspective is the regulators and regulatory requirements? Is that the key aspect of what you're dealing with these days? Versus obviously you have to look at the business requirements, quickly onboarding, quickly reviewing, but the key driver ends up being the regulator.
Yeah, that's a really good question, Doug. And absolutely right. We have to obviously comply with the local regulatory requirements, but at the same time, you have to look at, it's not a one-size-fits-all. So, there are things where you take a risk-based approach on items, understanding the various business models, and it's really important to have that dialogue with the regulators on an ongoing basis and being proactive as well. Because I cannot emphasize enough that when regulations are drawn up, they are across a broad spectrum. There's retail banks, and a lot of firms don't have a retail element. Yeah. So you have to sort of take those regulations and then look at how they're best adapted to our footprint or your footprint, your setup, and your business model, which really does take prominence.
So when you speak to the regulators, and I assume you're managing an ongoing relationship with the regulators. For those who are listening today who are either in banks where they're still building out their relationship with the regulator, or they're potentially in digital banks or fintechs that are just starting to be regulated by the HKMA, by the MAS, potentially the SFC, that ongoing relationship, how receptive are the regulators to that? Is it something where they want to come in and just audit you from time to time, or is it something where they're perfectly happy to build that relationship with you on an ongoing basis so they understand where you're coming from if something comes up in the future?
Yeah. No, certainly I can only comment on my experiences, and the regulators have been very receptive to have that engagement and also, have that two-way process where we're discussing things and they appreciate the fact that we're being proactive. Yeah. And what I do see in some of the other countries where the regulations maybe not have matured as much in other Asia countries, that they also want to understand more what our practices are. Yeah. When we look at what we're implementing from a head office perspective and understand more what we're doing from a best practice. So I have to say I certainly find the engagements that we've taken with the regulators very good they've certainly, we don't really see any countries where there's been any pushback and they've not wanted to have that dialogue. Obviously, when they do come in to do the inspections and they do the file reviews, they do go, and those of you on the line that have experienced the on-site inspections, they do go through with a fine-tooth comb. And that's why it really is important to, make sure we have the right documentation, we have up-to-date information, accurate information, and where there are areas where there may need to be a deviation or we can't get something, we have to ensure that we've got the right processes in place to cover that. A lot of banks will be familiar with the waiver process. And ensuring that you've got the right governance around that, the right approvals, we're obviously looking and we can demonstrate to the regulators that what we've been able to obtain, why certain things are not able to have been obtained, and what are the compensating controls around that. And I think, again, a lot of this is about documentation and making sure you can put your best foot forward. And that's something we really emphasize to our teams as well. That, always look at it as though somebody is looking at something when it comes to KYC with a blank sheet of paper. And we've got to really put it forward, what we've done, what's been the approval process, when you look at high risk, medium risk, low risk files. Again, that takes different focuses and is expected to have different levels of due diligence on that. One area, just to sort of mention on the regulatory perspective, and some of you will have seen the accountability that not just the banks have and are held to account, but individuals are also held to account. And, just yesterday it became announced that a major financial institution in China is being fined for lack of KYC controls. So it's really important to emphasize first line of defense, second line of defense. This is an area we've spent a lot of time over the past few years, that this is not a problem, KYC for compliance. It's not a problem for the AML function. All functions have got a vested interest in this process to ensure they get it right. Obviously, with the first line of defense, that's the onboarding teams, their responsibilities, the AML functions responsibilities when things have to be escalated, when there's areas in particular of high-risk clients potentially being onboarded. Then on the third line of defense with audit, who are looked at being our checkers to make sure, we are adhering to the policies, procedures. And, there is, certainly I know there is always a lot of frustrations with the business, and partly to your earlier question, Doug, the businesses do get frustrated with the amount of policy. They sometimes feel a lot of bureaucracy laid in, but I think that's also because the challenges we're facing dealing with our country regulators, dealing with our home regulators as well, there is so much to be covering in this field.
I think that's a really important point, because what I think people sometimes overlook is when you're in compliance is you need to have that relationship, obviously, with the regulators and with everybody externally, but just as important is having that relationship with the business, because then same thing as with the regulators. When there's an anomaly or there's an exception, you have a strong working relationship with them to make sure that it's something that you can work through together rather than being adversarial, because there's nothing gained for the organization when that relationship is adversarial.
Yeah, and that leads me on to the next point I wanted to cover, which was on quality assurance. And, it's really important. We've talked about being proactive with the regulators, but to the point you've raised, Doug, with the business as well, it's not a situation, nor should it ever be, that policies, procedures are drawn up and they're thrown out there. We, certainly in the second line of defense, have that vested interest to make sure we are proactively engaging with the business, explaining what we are requiring them to do, why we're requiring them to do, doing training. One area that we've seen a lot of benefits has been quality assurance. And, I place a lot of importance on quality assurance of files, so we know somebody's not dropping the ball. We are adhering to our requirements. But at the same time, there's no point having 50% of files failing that the business have been responsible for onboarding. Let's be, and you should be, more proactive by working with the business to identify what are the themes of those failures. Have we not trained them up properly? Have we not communicated requirements clearly enough? And what we've done is also co-locate teams together. co-locating the quality assurance function together with the business so they can work side by side, they can bounce things off, and it is not a situation where they're told they did something wrong 3 months ago. Let's, identify the issues and identify them in a timely basis. And the regulators appreciate that we are taking those steps as well. Yeah. And also talking about efficiencies, and I think that's a big buzzword that everyone is under, has been under and will be ever further. It is a huge cost of compliance with regard to the onboarding teams, the checks that are required for KYC when we talk about quality assurance and file reviews. But I always state, very clearly that, where we can centralize functions and not have to have each country doing its own thing, that's another area. Yes, there are certain tougher regulators where, due to data privacy issues, you have to have the things onshore. But again, one of the things we've sort of been looking at where that's permissible is centralizing those functions. Then it allows the AML teams to be more strategically focused, and also when you have a centralized function, you get much more efficiencies in order to do the onboarding and the file reviews as well.
Well, it's really interesting you say that. It is something that I'm going to speak about to give everybody out there a view on what the market sees in the requirement for efficiencies, but to have that not only helps reduce costs for a company, which is always contentious between a business and a risk function, but also it helps to streamline things and speed up onboarding. And I think that that's probably the most important part and the most contentious part of the relationship is when a compliance department is saying no and a business is saying yes, and how do you find the middle ground on that, right?
Yeah.
That's it. And so if you can be as efficient as possible, I think that is hugely important.
Yeah. No, absolutely concur with that. And it is, I think dialogue is always the best thing, having that engagement with the business and having that two-way partnership, which is the best way it will always work, and finding the middle ground at the end. Just a very last point before I hand over to Doug, and it really sort of leads into what Doug is going to cover, is on automation. And, I was just mentioning about efficiency, looking at centralizing functions, but also automation really is going to be more and more for focus, not just on the quality benefits you get by automating processes versus manual. Wherever you have manual processes, that always opens you up to higher risk. Mistakes can be made. Automation also has the big benefits, from efficiency as well. Looking at deploying of bots is obviously an important thing in the space. It reduces costs. And also, where you have duplicate processes, repeat processes occurring, again, where automation can come in and really help and streamline that process end to end, I think is a big focus. Not just regulators are looking at, but the banks are paying a heightened focus in this area.
It's really interesting, and it's such a key area of improvement for banks, and especially in compliance departments. I remember when I was in banking, I was a relationship manager, and we had a client, and we did the KYC checks, we did the screening checks, and I was handed a stack of papers about this thick on my desk, and there's nothing efficient about that process. Once you have a stack of papers involved that I'm looking at them one by one, I'm going through, is this not this guy, not this guy, this guy's dead, then I have to go back and type into the system, no, it's not this person. There's nothing efficient about that process. And I think a lot of the problem, as I see it, having been in banking and now sitting on the technology side, is a lot of antiquated systems and setups. And it's been in banks that I've worked in, and you see it where one sort of system gets bolted onto the next system, gets bolted onto the next system, and it's a mishmash. And the problem is that streamlining it becomes difficult, because if system A sends to system B, which sends to system C and X, but then sends down to system D, to remove a single piece means that the finance department in Indonesia might no longer get the data feed that they need. It ends up looking a bit like this. And for those of you out there who are seeing the slides, this might be familiar to you. It's something that we have seen sort of time and again when we're speaking to banks. And oftentimes I spend as much time talking about technology stacks, than we do talking about actual compliance. And I think that in a lot of ways, especially in this day and age, it requires taking a step back.
Yeah.
I mentioned sometimes when I talk about a story that I read at the very beginning of my career. I started in hedge fund credit risk management, and there was a book that came out, and it was sort of 21 stories about hedge fund managers at the time. And it was, some of them were quirky, about golf courses that people own and things like that. But the author of the book talked about how at his hedge fund every year on January 1st, which was a holiday, this was written in the U.S., it's a holiday in the U.S., his whole team, his whole management team would sit down together with their entire portfolio, and they would look at their portfolio and they would put it to the side. And then they would say, okay, if we had our perfect portfolio today, what would it look like? And then they would look at the portfolio they actually have versus the portfolio they want to have and build a plan to, over the course of 1, 2, 3 months, the first quarter, how to transition to that portfolio that they actually wanted. And it's a conversation that we have with banks, is looking at this slide, looking at this mess and saying, how can we get from this to the KYC onboarding process that we actually want to have? Because at its core, a KYC onboarding process is actually relatively straightforward, right? If you have an online presence, if you're a digital bank, if you're a retail bank that has a digital portal, then you want to do a digital KYC on the entity that connects to you. You then have to verify, in your case as an investment bank, you have to verify who the UBOs are, you have to verify who the directors are, and then verify their identity. You have to do the full identity verification after that. You have to do your sanctions, adverse media, and PEP checks, continuing periodic checks, and then again, if you're a digital presence, if you're a retail bank or you're the retail bank of a large bank, you, with a digital presence and a digital portal, you have to do that ongoing monitoring. It's really very simple when you take a step back and think about it, right? But I think maybe you can tell us a little bit more about how the difficulties of why is this difficult? How do you get sort of from here back to here? Because it's really not as straightforward as just putting up 2 slides in a deck.
I think exactly how you articulated it, Doug, is very right. It should be simple. It should not be as complicated as it ends up being for institutions. And I think just to touch first on the point you raised earlier about all the various systems, data quality, it's a huge challenge for everyone regarding legacy systems, systems not talking to each other, information not being kept up to date. And, that is a big, big challenge that you face, especially when banks merge and then they're taking on 2 different systems that have come together. Things then get bolted on. And that's one of the areas, to your question, which causes the problems when we come into this sort of end-to-end life cycle and being able to execute it as efficiently as possible. And I think the real challenges come when there is certain information required that is not readily available. And that then sends people into sort of a spiral. Well, what do we do now? Can we still onboard? What are the alternatives we can do? I think the other part that you also touched on was ongoing monitoring. It is all very well that we have a great onboarding initial KYC process in place. We've done everything required. But the ongoing monitoring side of things is very, very important, because a client you take on board today, you don't know what that person is going to be in a year's time, 2, 3 years' time. And that is why there is just so much focus on making sure we've got the right controls, doing the ongoing file reviews, event-driven reviews, to make sure that we are proactively identifying, has there been any deviation in that client profile, and then looking, maybe somebody was a low risk and that has to now be tagged high risk, because also with the benefit of what you see in the media, new scandals come up. That's more knowledge and information all institutions have, and should then apply that going forward in order to sort of refresh their KYC processes.
And it sort of leads back to what we were discussing a couple of minutes ago about having that relationship between the business, between the first line and the second line of defense, because it's really that first line of defense who's interacting with the clients on an everyday basis. It's not the second line of defense. But if you have that relationship and the first line understands their responsibilities in terms of compliance, then there's real value there in them being able to find things that don't make sense.
Absolutely right. Because
it's much rarer that I think something would come across compliance's desk that they say, this doesn't make sense. And I'm talking about outside of regular reviews, right? But, in between the review cycle, there's much less that comes across compliance's desk than comes across the salesperson's desk. Yes, you're right. If there's something in the news, then yes, that will absolutely come out. If you're doing, screening, you're doing your daily screening, it's something that will pop up. But if there are transactions that don't make sense, or if there's somebody who's, phoning in an order from a place that they normally haven't been in the past, or, there's a new entity that's become part of a transaction that wasn't there before, it's the first line of defense that sees all those things before it ever gets to compliance.
Correct.
And so I think it goes back to the that conversation that compliance has to start to take on with the business, because in my experience in banking, it doesn't happen the other way around. Compliance has to take on that relationship with the business and say, hey, we're here to work together. We need your help. We need you checking.
I think that point of partnership is really key, and the proactiveness, working with, yes, we know where the responsibilities lie between first, second line, but we're all working for the same firm. We've all got the same goal, and it's more, to sort of, as you say, jump across the fence and support and help where it's needed. Because as you rightly say, a lot of times you may not have the business being that proactive back, and there is absolutely no harm with the compliance or AML function, checking in regularly, making sure all is okay. Or when you as I said, on something like QA, you see some themes where there are defects, looking at those trends and working with them to rectify.
Because at the end of the day, when you're in a risk function, you likely need to find a financial criminal or some type of fraud or an actual crime taking place for the business to immediately say, yes, let's put a full stop on. For compliance to be able to say full stop on this, it has to be something egregious.
Yeah.
Whereas if you have that relationship with the business, and I experienced this over my career in finance, if you have that relationship with the business, it's at that point that you can go to them and say, look, this doesn't look right. This doesn't smell right. There's something wrong here. Can you go back and do more investigation? Or can you ask them these questions and start to bring them on side? When they see that there's something problematic here, that's when you're really going to drive to stop a questionable transaction or a questionable client from being on board.
Absolutely right.
And I think you raised an important point earlier, which is the straight-through processing. To do something on an exception basis, you absolutely need to be discussing all of the exceptions that you are seeing that are coming out. But the vast majority of clients are actually, it turns out, despite the amount of time we spend talking about financial crime, the vast majority of clients are not financial criminals. And so you want this process to be as frictionless as possible for them. And so to have technology where there's straight-through processing, to have, if you look at the slide, the digital KYC done, and then, that ID and passport information scanned into a system where if you have OCR, if you have optical card readers, you can take that information off the passport, you can take it off the ID card and immediately fill it into your identity verification system. You can feed it into your sanctions and PEP checks, and then on an ongoing basis, you can do those periodic checks. So really, in a good setup, the vast majority of clients should never know there's a compliance process going on in the background, right? In a proper setup. And I think where banks are struggling now is getting from this stage where everything is manual,
True.
and everything requires printing out a paper and having somebody checking it, to this stage. And it's interesting, and it's somewhere where, I think a lot of the digital banks are obviously learning from, and the virtual banks are learning from the traditional banks. They're learning from them in terms of banking, and the ones that come from fintech companies haven't been banks in the past, so they're learning about compliance and all these things. But where the traditional banks, the bricks and mortar banks, can really learn from the virtual banks is in that technology stack.
Yeah.
And to start to look at it as, how can we create straight-through processing? How can we make this an exception-based process rather than have papers flying all around the office? Because at the end of the day, it's problematic. And as we look at it, the gains that can be made from increasing the use of technology and increasing the use of efficient technology are huge. And if you look at this, you can see there are three different columns here. Companies that use one or no pieces of technology, companies that use two or three pieces of technology, and then four or more. And what you'll find here is that the companies that are using no technology are incredibly less efficient than the companies that are using a lot of technology. And what you see in the most interesting piece is at the bottom, where you see the average cost of compliance per FTE is $12,000 more, and this is U.S. dollars. This isn't Hong Kong dollars. $12,000 more per person to run a compliance department without strong technology, without efficiency of technology, without that automation, than it is with it. And I don't think that these are going to be surprising results for you.
I think, look, it goes on to the point that I mentioned earlier as well about really the focus has to be on using technology in 2 points. One is, as you've highlighted, the cost element. Every institution is so cost-focused and how we can do things more efficiently, but it's also the technology that improves the control end-to-end, the ability for mistakes to be made or human error. And they're two really important factors. And I think this is something that, when you look at solutions, it's to articulate, okay, well, what is it going to cost us to deploy this? Yeah. And then looking at, well, what's the benefit going to be? And that benefit really should be bucketed in two separate buckets. One is the improvement in control, reduction of risk, and also what, obviously the finance departments and the accountants will always home in on is the cost. And, it will reduce this amount in FTE. And I think, just as you've articulated it, that's, how institutions should be looking at to say, yes, we see a product, we see something that is going to benefit our KYC onboarding, and being able to then state, well, what the benefits are. That's, certainly when we've looked at technology solutions and options in our institution, that's how we've sort of gone about, proposing it to the various cost committees, cost councils, in terms of why putting the business case together, they're the two key factors along these lines.
And I think that that's somewhere that the virtual banks, the digital banks, the fintech companies, the new payments companies that are coming into the space, I think that that's a place where they can really learn, because oftentimes we'll get a call and it will be, oh, we need this screening solution, or, oh, we need this ID verification solution. And when we go and speak to them and say, okay, why do you need that? And they say, oh, because we were told we have to have it. That's the wrong answer, right? And look, most of my job is actually helping our team to sell these products, right? So you never want to get in the way of the sale, but what you really need is you need the companies to understand what they need and why they need it.
That's right.
Right? And so the question really should be, what do we need to accomplish? And then what is the technology that will help us accomplish it? Because if you need ID verification, if you need screening, if you need digital monitoring, all of these things can work, but if you can have them speak together and you know what each step needs to do, then it is much more efficient. You can build the process, and then you build the technology to fit into it.
Yeah.
And probably before any of this even happens, you need the risk assessment of the business to understand what the risks are. And I think it's a subject we haven't really touched on. We've been more focused on the KYC, but to do that initial risk assessment of the business, of who your clients are, of what your geographies are, of what your products are, understanding that helps answer all of those questions.
And I think your point, Doug, is a very valid one, that the newer established firms, the startups, have had the advantage of being able to set up their own technology infrastructure, have it much more modernized, and don't have the same limitations that the mainstream banks have with legacy systems, with older systems. And I think that's one advantage they have, and it makes deploying a tool a lot more easier for them. Because one of the other things that we will always look at is it's not just what's the cost of the tool, and obviously this is the bells and whistles and the great things it will deliver, but how can we actually deploy it? If we've got, and we know we've got some archaic technology infrastructure, can that tool actually be easily deployed? How long will it take our IT people? And that's also other factors that need to be built into the case as well.
It's really interesting, and it sort of takes in, again, the compliance department needs to be having those meetings of what do we need to be doing right now to satisfy regulator requirements, but also what should we be looking for 5 years from now? Now, it needs to be flexible, I think. I think if you looked back sort of 3 to 5 years, everybody was saying blockchain, 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 blockchain. Now we don't talk about blockchain very much anymore. And so you need to be that flexibility if it's something that you were investigating to maybe look somewhere else. There are definitely solutions in there for the blockchain people. Please don't get upset at me for using that as the example, but it's something where you need some level of flexibility, but at the same time you need to be thinking longer term as well. You know, it's difficult in sort of a quarterly earnings cycle, you know, in an annual bonus cycle. You still have to be thinking about the business on sort of a 3 to 5 year rolling basis as well. And really, in terms of that, and in terms of this cost, the other real advantage that we find, and by the way, these statistics all come from our True Cost of Compliance survey that LexisNexis Risk Solutions ran in 2019, and we're on the process of compiling again now. We found as well, and this is the key thing that you need to discuss with your business when you're talking about technology spend. This is essential. If you look at, on the top line is average hours required to onboard a customer for due diligence, right? To complete a customer due diligence. For companies that use 4 pieces of compliance technology, same terms as before, versus companies that use 1, take to onboard business accounts, which are the most difficult, the foreign business accounts, 9 less hours to onboard them per customer. When you talk about efficiency, this is it right here. This improves the client experience. This improves staff morale. This improves the business's experience in dealing with compliance. These are where the real wins are. This is why technology is so important. Now, obviously, I'm with a technology company, but I think you can verify, you can testify to the fact that that technology makes life easier.
Absolutely, and I think one thing is it builds also that credibility with the business, with the senior management, that we are continually exploring ways to make things a lot more efficient. And, you know, as you've outlined, when you look at what those savings are, and then you times it by the number of accounts, by the number of clients, that's not peanuts at all. And these are things, you know, that have to constantly be looked at and going with that case, because it really does sort of open up eyes when we've done similar sort of updates to the business or presentations to say, these are things we're looking at or initiatives, these are going to be the benefits, or if we've deployed a bot, this was how the situation was before, and then after, you know, it does open eyes when they see and it's crystallized what savings have been realized.
And I think, you know, to take something out of the news recently, for those of you who have not watched the SpaceX launch to the ISS, the International Space Shuttle, I highly recommend that you go do it. It's an amazing feat of technology. But what I found most interesting about it, and what people have raised to me, is when you look at the old space shuttle, it looks like an airplane built in the 1980s.
Mm-hmm.
You know, when you look at Endeavour, when you look at those old shuttles, it ran, the technology and the computer stacks that it ran on were, I think they had like 1 megabyte of memory, right? You could not save a selfie on the space shuttle's computers. However, if you looked at the Falcon 9 that went up a couple days ago, I think it was Saturday night, our time, it looked like they were driving a Tesla into space. It was incredible. Everything was touchscreen. Everything was high definition. It was stunning in its simplicity and in how they let the technology do the work. Now, obviously, this is an extreme, and they took 9 years off sending shuttles from the United States soil up into space. However, it sort of shows you how, over time, you can build something new, a new technology that is significantly more efficient and significantly more user-friendly to use. And if you haven't seen it, it has nothing to do with compliance, but it's absolutely beautiful to watch. I think we're going to take a moment for a couple key takeaways here and a couple final questions that I have for you, Viv. But then we're going to open it up to questions from the audience. I think key takeaways here, you can see them on the screen, right? Regulatory oversight is only going to strengthen. You know, in Hong Kong, in Singapore, they are the market leaders in Asia. They are going to continue to tighten their expectations of controls by the banks in the region. There's no question about that. But what that means is that all of the regional, all of the local regulators are going to follow.
Absolutely.
All of the countries around the region. And it's something that you need to be prepared for now. And it's always easier to get your best-in-class policies and procedures in place now than scramble and do it when the regulators And if I just may add on, Doug, I think the other point to that now is the regulators are going to that next level of holding individuals accountable for failings. And that's really important as well, that people are aware of their liability and getting things right, because that's now the next level. It is not just you get a report, you do a remediation. They are now, obviously tasking those that are accountable and holding them to that. Yeah, definitely. And in terms of those controls, the more that it's automated, the more that it's repetitive, the technology is there to do it the same way every single time, the more straight-through processing is, it allows for a better allocation of resources and better control of the process. I think any time that you include sort of the human element into a process, you have the possibility of there being human error, right? And whereas the system is simply repetitive. Meaning that KYC that's worked by staff on an exception-only basis really is the best approach, because the less that those human hands touch it, the less that there can be errors from a lack of judgment, a mistake, a misunderstanding, a misreading, rather than that repetitive approach by the computer system.
And it's also allowing the teams to be more strategic and focusing their talents where it really should be, as opposed to just doing repetitive processes.
Yeah. I think that that's a really key takeaway. People ask us, when you talk about more technology, you talk about straight-through processing, are you talking about getting rid of staff? And we are absolutely not talking about getting rid of staff. We're talking about upskilling that staff to, instead of checking level 1 alerts, to check level 2 alerts, or to check, to be there to check exceptions and to be more value add. The AI is great, but at this point, it's not accessible or cheap enough to be able to do the types of investigations that people can do. However, they can check off those level 1 alerts much better and much more efficiently than we can.
Absolutely.
And finally, just that a better allocation of resources will lead to a more efficient process. I think the numbers on the last slide show this. And to have a better client and staff experience, there's, I think the idea that better technology will make your staff happier is a pretty simple and straightforward one that people are finally coming around to. And there's real value in that, because if I don't have to do those repetitive tasks, I'm not going to get frustrated by doing those repetitive tasks. if I'm not going to have a stack of papers dropped on my desk, I'm not going to be frustrated by having to go through that stack of papers. And I think there's real value there for for the staff and obviously for clients on being onboarded faster.
And I think one of the things that all of you that are involved in the KYC process would have also experienced, frustration of the client being asked for something that they'd already provided or was readily available. Yeah. And that's something, where that does really cut down on that and, as Doug mentioned, lead to a better experience and relationship.
Now, I would be remiss if we didn't have a COVID-related question in here. Now, our view is obviously here in Asia Pacific, we're obviously moving at different speeds, but Hong Kong, Singapore, Australia, New Zealand, we're starting to move through it. We're starting to look beyond it. I think there will be a lot of countries that will be following shortly. Obviously, China as well is starting to move past it. And so I guess the question is really forward-looking past COVID. Do you see eKYC as something that's sort of been taken on during the crisis? Do you see it as something that will stay with us, or do you think we're going to go back to these old traditional ways of doing KYC?
No, I think it's a very important point here, and I think it's really this current situation is forcing all institutions and the regulators to really think long and hard now in terms of going forward what the future approach is and looking at other ways that maybe prior to February would not have been considered as options or ways to look at with the KYC processes. So to answer your question directly, yes, I do foresee eKYC being deployed a lot more. You already see this with the Hong Kong, Singapore regulators on the wealth management side, where they're now approving dispensations to look at video onboarding of clients, because obviously having those face-to-face meetings in the current situation is challenging. Now, that is only on a temporary basis they're approving it, but could that also be something that's looked at more carefully by the regulators going forward? So I think absolutely the eKYC is going to be far more important going forward once we come out of the coronavirus. And I think, one thing we've seen, again, one of the initial points that I made at the start about the proactiveness dialogue with regulators, that has been even more so important now during coronavirus, whereas we've had, and a lot of institutions have got commitments on the KYC for file reviews, for remediation deadlines. But unfortunately now a lot of the clients are not there in terms of they're not in their offices. Obtaining that documentation is not going to be easy currently based on their domicile. So again, having that flexibility with regulators where they've actually been very open that certain deadlines or commitments that we've offered may need to be extended. And regulators have certainly been open because they realise the challenges that all the banks are in currently as part of either the onboarding process or the ongoing monitoring process.
Yeah, and I think that it's a really important point of view because I think the regulators are starting to see the value in eKYC and that some of the solutions are actually better. Again, we talk about human error. Some of the solutions are better than what people were doing in terms of checking ID, making sure that people are who they say they are. And if you look at the virtual banks in Hong Kong, the digital banks in Singapore, Malaysia, there's an understanding by the regulators that eKYC is going to be the way of the future. I think coronavirus has probably helped push that forward a bit.
Absolutely.
So now I guess moving on to your questions. We do have some in here.
Talk, Doug. I forgot to remind everybody that you can type your questions into the Q&A box, and after you've done that, hit the submit button. We will try to get to as many questions as we can. And, Doug, I really want you to know that everybody's saying happy birthday to you, but we also got one that had nothing to do with birthday that said, I love Doug. So it must be your birthday.
Fantastic.
Yep.
I hope my wife didn't join us.
Here's one for you
Great.
from Andrew. It says, do you mean that the 35 FTE is the break-even point for technology to contribute to compliance work? And I'm going to show you the slide you were on when you were talking about this, just to make sure Andrew his question really gets answered.
I think it was the slide before this one. Let me go one back.
Okay.
So I don't think that that's the break-even point. I think it just happens to be the level at which the companies that we surveyed were, they were staffed at. Now you can see by the amount that they're spending on their programs. First of all, you can see by the amount that they're spending on their programs that they are smaller companies, right? However, when you look at the percentage of the cost of labor, that average number of compliance staff, if they use technology, I don't know that it would go lower. I think it would go lower in terms of who was working on resolving alerts. However, what you could do is take the best of those people who were resolving alerts and train them to be investigators, train them to look at, the second level alerts where you've done an immediate investigation, a very quick investigation, said, okay, we can't confirm or deny that this is this person, and then allow them to train up to do further investigation, use tools that do that next level of searching. I assume that you guys spend a lot of time with your staff doing this sort of thing.
No, absolutely right. No, I concur what you've articulated there.
And so I think as those companies grow, obviously the cost of the department is going to grow, the number of people is going to grow, but it grows exponentially. It doesn't grow in a straight line. And so that cost, as you see, the percentage of cost of labor comes down and the total cost comes down versus the size of the department itself. So I think that's the real value there. It's not, what is sort of the break-even number of staff.
It's got to be emphasized, every firm is very different. Every firm has its own infrastructure, its own operational base as well, and it varies on the product offerings, the type of businesses, the risk appetite of the type of clients they're taking. These are all various factors which, it's not a one-size-fits-all.
Yeah, absolutely.
So Vivek,
Thank you, Mary.
Ning wants to know, Vivek, what is your view on how to ensure quality and adherence to local requirements when centralizing KYC process?
Yeah, so look, I think centralization, and that was one of the points I touched on earlier, is a very important area that all firms are looking at in order to make things, more efficient and create a centralized function of excellence as well, rather than have things dotted around different countries. I think the first thing people have got to be wary of is data privacy. It's not something you can centralize for every single country here in the region because there are certain regulators which require the processes to be done onshore, and also they're all very strict in terms of any data going offshore. Where it is permissible and allowable amongst countries, I think having those functions centralized, obviously having an effective quality assurance team that is monitoring the output and the work that they are performing, looking at the lessons learned, looking at, okay, these are the areas that we're going to focus on, what are the areas of defects that come up, and making sure they are remediated on a timely basis is very, very important. And I think if you are going to, or firms are looking at building out a centralized utility, you have all those benefits that I've mentioned on efficiency, having the center of excellence, but you've also got to make sure the quality of the work and output is managed and it's overseen as well, because every country AML function, if they are allowing a centralized function, the regulators would expect to demonstrate oversight. How are you overseeing that centralized function is executing the local laws and regulations?
And I think, to sort of show the opposite of that, I've seen situations in banks where, if they have 19 or 20 different branches throughout the region, and each country is responsible for their KYC, some branches use the standardized system, some use their own local system, some had paper files sitting in drawers, right? And if we just take the paper files sitting in drawers, there is no way that you can have control over that as a centralized compliance department if there's a file in a drawer in a country that you are not currently in.
Yeah, and I think oversight is really key with the SMEs. You can't centralize something or move it offshore and then forget about it and think it's somebody else's problem, because that's where the quality issues will then just moving from one area to another. It's really important. That's something we've done a lot of focus on and had a lot of success stories in centralization of utilities and offshoring by ensuring the SMEs are still overseeing the quality and output of the work. Yeah.
So
thank you, Mary.
From Shabhata, and for you, Doug, do you think that blockchain will help to streamline the KYC and CDD functions?
We talk a lot about blockchain, but I guess what concerns me about it, and the reason why I think it hasn't won over the entire KYC community yet, is because there are two major issues as I see it. It's the immutability of it, and then who controls the actual blockchain, who's doing the calculations and the management of it. Because the problem is if you don't know who controls it, you don't know how it can be changed, if it can be changed in the past, what the controls around the blockchain itself are, and that's concerning. But even if it is a fully trustworthy KYC blockchain, the problem is, to me, the immutability. And if a financial criminal can get through the processes and get put into the blockchain, then that sort of positive result for them is there forever. And so, for me, I think that there is a need for a government to own that sort of blockchain KYC in the way that they distribute really the identification cards, the passports, the driver's license, the ID cards, depending on where you are. The government would have to own that, and no government has really at this point, other than one or two, I believe Dubai in the UAE has shown interest in a blockchain KYC, but not too many countries have shown an interest at a sovereign level to own that blockchain KYC, and that's why I think it's not at the point where it's sort of fully delivered yet. As a module within a KYC program, I think it definitely could have value, but I think there are some kinks that haven't been worked out.
Thank you, Doug. Can you give us a closing comment? You've sure covered a lot of things. What should we walk away remembering today?
Absolutely. I think, first of all, here are Viv and my contact info. If you do want to connect with us on LinkedIn, please go ahead and do so. If you have any further questions, please reach out. But I think the key things to remember are regulations are never going to get looser. So it's time to start solving the problems now rather than waiting until they hit you in the face. Automation is there to help you. It's helped to resolve problems. It's helped to create efficiencies. It's there to make your life and your staff's life and your client's life easier. And using it to the best way possible is really going to benefit you and your business. Additionally, I think that relationship when you sit in compliance or if you're in the business and you've joined this webinar, it's really important to have that relationship with your with the other parts of the business. If you're in compliance, have that relationship with the business. If you're in the business, have that relationship with compliance, because when it hits the fan, that relationship is what's going to help you get through it. Obviously, we did talk about a number of different things today. If you have more questions, please feel free to reach out to us. If you would like to talk about the types of solutions that we can help you provide, we can provide to you to make yours a more efficient business, please feel free to let us know. Thank you so much for joining us today. Viv, thank you. Thank you for joining us today. And we look forward to speaking to all of you again soon. Thank you very much, and have a great day.
Thank you, Doug and Vivek. Thank you for your presentations and for sharing your birthday with us. And we'd also like to say thanks to our audience. If we didn't answer your question today, representatives from LexisNexis Risk Solutions will be in touch shortly with the information you need. And we'll also be sending this webinar recording within the next few days. Finally, please fill out our short survey before you leave the event. There are new LexisNexis Risk Solutions webinar sessions scheduled every week on the latest financial crime compliance-related topics, so please look for our invite and join us. Once again, thank you, and have a great day.
Thank you.